Hi, my name is Dale Maley. Today in this video we're going to talk about an interesting project that I recently finished, and it was replacing a wooden sign for our swimming pool in Fairbury, Illinois. As you can see from the photograph, the old sign was pretty much shot. The top of the sign had rotted and fallen off, and I'm trying to estimate how old the first sign was. It was built sometime between 1983 and 1998. If it was 1983, it would be 40 years old. That's awful good for a wood sign to last that long. The sign is made up of 6 boards. There's 3 on each side. Each board is 2 by 12 and is 10 foot long. The letters are recessed about a quarter of an inch, and they're about 6 inches tall. And the old sign was held together with 3/8 diameter galvanized bolts. Now, my strategy on making this replacement sign was to first determine what font type was used and try to duplicate that. Then make a router template pattern or patterns using 3/16 inch thick Luan plywood. I would print out the letters from SketchUp, a drafting program, and then carbon trace the letters onto the Luan plywood. Then I would jigsaw out the letters in the Luan, then use those to route out the letters on the sign, and I would probably need to make 2 passes with a router, about 1/8 inch on each pass, to net about a 1/4 inch deep letters. So in SketchUp I played around, and the closest font that I could find was called Clearview Highway 4B. And that's very similar to what you see on highway signs on the streets and roads. I may have downloaded this font to SketchUp some time ago on an earlier project. I really can't remember, but I know that font is available for free on the internet. My new sign had 6 inch letter height, and I had to scale it 1.26 times in the vertical direction to get the right ratio of letter height to letter width. Now, here's the new sign drawn up in SketchUp, and it's really 2 signs because there's a sign on both sides, or lettering on both sides of this. So on the one side, this is what it looks like in SketchUp, looking east. And here's the view in SketchUp, the back side, or other side of the sign, which would be looking west in this case. Now, if I owned a CNC machine, I could set the boards in the machine, turn it on, and then it would automatically engrave or cut out all the letters. But I don't own a $3,000 CNC machine, so we're going to do this project old school. And I'm using a router, and I am basically the computer running the router. And then there's a guide bushing on the bottom of the router that will fit into a thin wood template. And all I have to do is keep the router inside of the template and then route out the letters. Now, on a big project like this, I usually make a little test run to make sure everything's going to work okay. So I made 2 letters, F and an L, and I just decided to route out the L first just to try everything out. But while I was routing the L, I felt the router slip out of the pattern, so I stopped, and I wondered what happened. When I turned the router over, I was really surprised to see that the brass bushing was broken. Now, this brass bushing came from an old Sears sign making kit, and I actually used that kit a few years ago to make some smaller signs, and it worked fine. So I'm not sure why it broke on this project. And I was also using the bit that came with the sign making kit, and it's a 1/4 inch diameter with a round nose on the bottom. This broken bushing stopped production on this replacement sign, so I went on Amazon and I found a replacement kit with a selection of bushings, including the 5/16 bushing that I was using on this project. So had to wait a couple days to get the new kit from Amazon. This new kit did work very well. Once I had the new router attachment with the brass bushing, went ahead and printed out first sign board from SketchUp. Here you can see Floyd. And then comes out in 8.5 by 11 sheets that you have to cut and tape together from SketchUp to get the big sign. Then I used blue masking tape to temporarily attach it to the Luan. I slipped carbon paper between the white paper and the board, and then traced out all the letters so I could saw them out using a jigsaw. Now I wanted a smooth surface for that little brass bushing to follow in the Luan patterns. So I went to my Fairbury Ace hardware store and I found the finest blade I could find for my jigsaw, which had 20 teeth per inch as shown in the picture. This blade worked very nicely. I got nice cuts and I had very few splinters. Here you can see the first Luan template that I completed, the Floyd and Marion part. You can see it here in my basement workshop. Here's a photo of my skill saw or jigsaw that I used to cut out the letters from the 3/16 inch thick Luan. Now when I went to the lumberyard to buy the 6 boards 2x12s that were 10 foot long, I was kind of careful how I selected them at the lumberyard, knowing that I would be using them to make signs. Then when I got the boards home, each time I went to use a board, I checked the one end with a square, and sometimes I'd have to use an electric planer to get it more squared up. Then I would measure it to exactly 120 inches in length, and then take a circular saw, and saw it to length. Fortunately, the boards were about 3/4 inch longer than 10 feet, so I had a little bit to cut off. Then of course I would pick which side was the best to put the signs on. The inside of the boards isn't used, so if you have a worse looking spot, you can always put it on the inside and then have the better surface facing out that you engrave the letters on. In this photo, you can see my 3/16 thick Luan pattern or template on top of the 2x12 board, and it's being held temporarily in place with C-clamps. And I started out with C-clamps, but it was easier just to use finishing nails and just use a couple nails to hold it in place, and then it was easy to pull the nails out and go on to the next pattern. And as I said before, I did 2 router passes. When I was done routing, I removed the Luan template and then used 80 grit sandpaper to sand the edges of the letters. Pressure treated wood is kind of fibrous and you'll have little pieces sticking out, so it's nice to sand those off before you paint. Here's a photo showing the box of finishing nails that I used to temporarily hold the Luan templates in place. They're just 3D 1.25" finish nails. Very easy to pull out when you're done. I also had to route the border edges in, which those grooves start 3/4 inch from the outer edge, and they were 7/8 inch wide. So I made another Luan pattern for routing those borders. I only did this one pass to about 3/16 inch deep on the border grooves. That seemed to look fine. I also made Luan patterns for the left end of the sign and a second pattern for the right end to make the decorative edges as shown here. Early on I did have the bit loosen up in the router, and it actually went deep, as you can see here, and I tightened it back up and kept checking it and never had any trouble for the other 5 boards. So maybe I just didn't have it tight enough that first time around. Going too deep's okay there. I just used some wood filler to fill it back in. I started out using the round nose 1/4 inch bit from the Sears sign making kit, but I found it left too many ridges in the bottom of the letters. So I switched over. I had a new bit, carbide bit as shown here. You can buy these so the chips are directed up or the chips are directed down. I don't remember which way this one was, but it sure worked a whole bunch better than the round nose bit did. I used the same bit on all 6 boards to make all the letters and all the borders. Now for the painting process that I used. First I primed the whole board with Zinsser's primer. Then I painted the back of the board dark brown, flipped it over. I painted the letters with 2 coats of white semi-gloss latex exterior. Then I finished by painting the front brown, and I used a small half-inch wide brush, and I kept that at right angles to the letters so I could do a good job of keeping the white letters separate from the brown background. In this photo, you can see where I'm using the half-inch wide brush to put on the last part of the paint process where I put the brown background in. As I said before, I learned to keep that brush at a right angle to the edge of the letter, and you can make a really nice transition between the white letter and the brown background. Here you can see I've got a couple of the signboards set up on sawhorses in my garage, and I'm putting on the final coat of brown paint on the front of the signs. Here you can see a photograph of the first of the 6 boards that I had the letters done on, along with all the painting work. So I was pretty encouraged when I saw the first one done. It really looked good, so I figured the rest of the sign's going to look good as well. One challenge I had on this project, working by myself, each of the 6 boards, the 2x12s, roughly weighed 50 pounds a piece. I'm going to have 6 of those, so 6 times 50 pounds is 300 pounds of weight. So what I did, I came up with some temporary supports for each end, and that will hold the new boards in place as I drill and get them bolted to the steel frame. On the south end, I designed up a temporary 2x4 support structure and set it on the concrete pad, as you can see here. On the south end of the sign, I took a short piece of scrap 2x4 and I used two woodworking clamps, and I clamped it, or I placed it up against the bottom of the old sign, and then I clamped to the steel frame. Then when I took the old sign off, as I started to install the new sign, I could simply rest it on the 2x4 on that end. As you can see in this photograph, I've almost got the old sign torn down. All that's left is the last piece on the front and one vertical piece. You can see the stack of the old signboards over on the left-hand side. Once I had all the wood signboards removed, I was left with the steel frame. It was a little rusty, so I wire brushed the whole steel frame, and I gave it one coat of flat black paint. As you can see, I used masking tape to keep the black paint off the concrete bases. Now, the process for installing the new boards was rather lengthy. I started on the west side, so I put the bottom piece first and rested on my temporary supports. I also set the west vertical board in place. Then from the back side, I drilled holes through the steel frame into the new boards. I slipped in a couple old bolts without nuts just to hold the board in place. Then I worked my way up. I added the middle board and drilled it from the back side, put a couple temporary bolts in, added the top board, and drilled it from the back side. Then I got to remove all the pieces of wood on the west side and then do the east side. So I repeated the process with the bottom board first, and I worked my way up to the top. Then I was able to put the west side boards back on, and then use a hammer and drive the new 3/8 galvanized bolts in. Then I had to counterbore the nut ends of the bolts so the washer and nuts would fit. And then I tightened up all the bolts. Here's a photo of the new 1-inch spade bit that I bought at Fairbury's Ace Hardware to counterbore the 3/8 diameter holes out to 1 inch so the washers and nuts would fit. This new bit worked very well and was close enough to be centered to the 3/8 holes to work okay. Now here's a photo illustrating how I drilled from the backside through the steel frame, the existing holes in the steel frame, into the new wood boards. I used a standard twist drill type bit, usually made for drilling steel. I was afraid if I tried using a wood auger style bit that it would catch on the 2.5-inch square steel tubing. So the standard twist drill worked fine. My sister Karen accidentally caught me working, doing the finishing touches on the sign, and took this picture. And here I'm finishing up attaching the round Prairie Lance medallion to the right hand side of the sign. So this wood sign had two large 24-inch diameter medallion signs. I removed them from the old wood sign and found out they are very heavy. They are cast aluminum. I used a 1/2-inch brush and I painted the top of the letters black. Now in retrospect, a small artist brush probably would have been better, but they turned out okay using the 1/2-inch brush. Then I bolted the new aluminum round medallions onto the new wood using 1/4-inch diameter bolts. Then I filled the bolt screwdriver slots with exterior wood filler to try to make the signs more tamper resistant so no one could easily remove them. So for the final paint touch-up, I had to touch up the wood counterbore holes that I drilled for the nuts and washers with brown paint. I also had to touch up with the brown and white paint where the bolts broke into the letters. Now if you're designing your own new sign, I would highly suggest you design it so the bolts do not break into the letters or say the border. But the holes were already drilled in this steel frame. I would have had to re-drill those in steel. So I did the same thing as the first people did, and I had a couple bolts that did break into the letters or into the border. So as carefully as I could, I used the brown and white lettering paint to fix the wood and also kind of hide the bolts, and they turned out okay. Now here's a photo of the finished sign, and this is looking west from First Street, looking west into the swimming pool building. Here's another photograph of the sign, but this time you're standing by the swimming pool and looking towards the east towards First Street. I finished up this sign on May 24th in 2023. Some closing thoughts on this project. It was much more time consuming than I originally estimated. Of course, I never made a sign 10 foot long and 3 foot high before either. Anyway, it took a long time just to make the 3 Luan templates for the 3 lines of lettering. Then, of course, 2 passes with a router and all the letters, and then 1 pass on all the border strips. Then you've got the priming and painting of the letters and the base sign. The installation itself only took 2 long days, which is not too bad. So far, everyone says the new brown and white sign looks much better than the original dark red and white sign. So everyone likes the new sign. So in summary, this video explains how to build a large wooden replacement sign. Hopefully my project gives you some ideas that you can use on your projects. Thanks so much for watching, and please subscribe. Thank you.